Hello and welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, allenwyma. Before we start our show, I just want to give a quick shout out that if you guys are looking for any help with your Flutter projects or Elixir or Rust, feel free to reach out to us. Go to our website at www.plangora.com. That's Plangora, Plangora.com. And go ahead and contact us and we should be able to hook you up with some help. Now back to the show. We have a very special guest who we're kind of similar hometown area. Joe I think it's pronounced Hocking. I forgot to ask you about that. So sounds correct. Would you shaking your head? Yes?
Yes.
So, Joe Hocking, who is a author of UnityInaction from Manning. And he is I guess I would say seasoned developer in Unity and just general game development. So the reason I brought him on here is because we had an episode about Unity and Flutter, and I think it'd be good to kind of hear more about Unity. So I know that a lot of people are interested in making games, and of course Unity is a game engine as opposed to Flutter, which is for making apps. We also have the Flame engine, which also came out recently, or within version 1.0. But there's limits, right? And I think that, with apps like Wallace and Gromit, where you can mix the two, Flutter and Unity, that this could be a very great tool for you guys to pick up if you're interested to do something similar. So enough of my long-winded talk. Joe, thanks for waiting for me. Now it's time for you to do a quick intro about yourself. Go ahead.
Sure. I started using Unity quite some time ago, actually, almost exactly a decade ago. I started using Unity. And then when I started using Unity, I was I already knew how to program though when I started. So, I just remember back then it was really frustrating for me, when I was learning Unity, just because a lot of the learning materials I was finding were, at the time, they were all assuming that you're like sort of basically new to developing anything, and so it was all these learning materials. It was all these tutorials that would start by, teaching like, oh, this is what a variable is. This is what a function is. And I every time I'd go, oh my God. And so, when this tech book publisher, you already mentioned Manning, when they contacted me about writing a book on Unity, what I decided to do is write a book, pretty much what I wish had existed when I was first learning Unity. I wrote a book that was kind of like, okay, you as the reader, you already know how to program, but I'm going to teach you Unity. So I'm just going to assume you already know what a variable is and stuff like that, and just get into how Unity operates. So yeah, that's what I wrote. As far as the book, at the time I was working for this company called Synapse Games here in Chicago, and I was making web games for them at the time. But this was right around when the bottom fell out of that market. Like web game, nobody, I don't know if you remember, everyone was into playing like Facebook games and
wait,
stuff
can
like
we talk about what is the technology you're using to make web games? So is that Flash, I'm guessing?
Yeah, that was Flash. Which again, just another example of like, yep, Flash is gone. It's dead as a dodo. So anyway, but yeah, so my boss at Synapse Games, he wanted to pivot the studio's products. He wanted to pivot to mobile games. And so he asked me to investigate some options for developing mobile games. And one of the options I investigated, the one I liked the most, and then after I presented it to him, the one he liked the most as well was Unity. And so that's when I started using Unity to port our games over to mobile. And I took to it so well that, like I said, this tech book publisher reached out to me and was like, oh, wow, you really know what you're doing. You want to write a book about this.
Can you talk a little bit more about the other, because this is obviously, I think you said 10 years in Unity, right? So what else was actually out there when you evaluated at the time?
So at the time, there, and some of these options, they still exist, but maybe in like slightly different forms, whereas like others like just plain don't exist anymore. Like I looked at, for example, using Cocos 2D, which is this library. I don't know what they call it these days. I'm pretty sure it's been like rebranded or something. But that was an interesting option. It's purely a 2D engine, though. I mean, it is nice to, even though we were making 2D games, it would be nice to have that option to work with 3D graphics, and that turned out to be super prescient, that, thinking. But meanwhile, we also, I evaluated like, what if we were making HTML5 games? And even though I would say these days, actually, that's a viable option to just like make, HTML5 games as like hybrid apps and that kind of thing. At the time, it was just too primitive to really, do really interesting stuff with. So I would say even today, making the decision, I would still probably choose Unity for sure. But like, it definitely is like a very different landscape. You know what I mean? It's like, it's less of a, obvious yes these days than it would have been back then, for sure.
So I'm kind of curious about what was like the deciding factor. Was it the fact that it's cross-platform, or was it? Yeah, I mean, because you said if it's Cocoa, right? That sounds like Apple only. So to actually hit the Android market, we'll be able to do it.
Like I was talking about Corona SDK. That one's cross-platform. There's another library called Cocos 2D, which I believe is like they have a port that runs on Android as well. But like, yes, it was initially designed specifically for like, iOS. In the end, the whole cross-platform thing, I don't know if that by itself was the deciding factor, but that is definitely one huge advantage of Unity, is like, it's just like ridiculously cross-platform. I mean, it's not just cross-platform like on mobile. It's like you can deploy Unity to, desktop, you can deploy it to web games, you can deploy these mobile apps. You can deploy it to like now, like these different VR headsets. Like, I mean, it is ridiculously cross-platform.
Yeah, I actually was using Unity quite a few years ago, but I wasn't actually a developer on that project, so I was a little bit more hands-off. I was just kind of managing it. And the reason that we picked it was because we wanted to export to different platforms, and also it was actually a rewrite of another application. It was like an app to interface with the systems of the company, which was using these cameras in forestry where you could detect, like they had a color camera which would have an algorithm to detect smoke based on, I guess, the way the colors or something. I'm not too sure about the algorithm. And also another one, which is a thermal camera, which would detect heat. And so it's all about how to detect forest fires, right? Because the thing is, usually they have one guy who's up in a tower, and people get bored, right? Because there's not a forest fire at once a week or once a month. It's like once in a while. And so when you're looking out with binoculars, you're going to get bored. You're probably going to pass out and fall asleep, just because it's so boring, I think. That's my guess. But, having a computer keep doing it for you is not a problem. But to like interface with the cameras and stuff, they use like a Python game engine to do this. And so they want something better. And so we looked at Unity, and we were writing everything in Unity. Because at the time, I never heard of Flutter at the time. I don't know if Flutter was even around at this time. This was like, I wouldn't be surprised if it was like 10 years ago or something crazy like that. So, but yeah, Unity was something for us. And actually, it was actually pretty cool because the way that app worked is that you'd have to take the camera, know where it is on the earth, and then take a look at the angle and then draw a line from the angle of the lens down. And then, because if you had a mountain, right, and you didn't have everything properly done with the earth, you could be hitting behind the fire or in front of the fire rather than right on the fire to try to detect where the fire could be. So I remember with Unity, we could actually draw the whole earth along with all the inconsistencies, because the earth is not a completely flat, or not completely flat, sorry. I'm not a flat earther, by the way. No, completely round, right? It's got dips and mountains and I'm sure even by itself, it's still a little bit off. It's more oblong or something. In any case, right, it was a pretty interesting project. So Unity definitely helped us out, and looked pretty nice too at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's sort of, Unity, like a tool like Unity or any game engine, really. Like, these aren't the tools you would reach for to develop, most like productivity apps or that, you know what I mean? But at the same time, anything involving graphics, really. And for example, you're talking about like something that needs to like simulate, the look of a landscape or whatever. Anything involving graphics, tools like Unity are great for. And then, the fact that it's like ridiculously cross-platform is just super convenient.
Yeah, I mean, so we were talking before the show. You said you looked a little bit at Flutter, but you never really got into it. Like, what were you actually looking at Flutter for?
So you made reference to us just chatting a little bit. What we were chatting about is basically you made some comment about I mean, definitely a tool like Unity is where you go to make games, and Flutter and I was commenting, and I was just pointing out like that's true for like the vast majority of what anybody, what the average person thinks of when they think of video game. But on the other hand, there are certain kinds of games where it's sort of like, even though it's a game, it's essentially like, like just this UI, like, you know what I mean? Like a text-based game or something. And then a tool like Flutter that actually is like super, is a really good tool for those kind of games. And so at one point, I never actually made it, but at one point I was thinking of making a game along those lines. And that's why I was evaluating some tools that would help me out. I mean, honestly, even for a game like that, Unity wouldn't be a terrible option, actually. But I did have some really specific requirements in mind that that Flutter would be better for. Among other things, like I know this is going to sound like a really weird requirement for a game, but I wanted to make something that would support you could play through a screen reader. So like blind people could play it with a screen reader, and it's like you can do that with a tool like Flutter, but you can't really do that with Unity.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think I feel like Unity is pretty mature. Game engines are very visual, right? People always care about how it looks. Right. And like when you check out a game, it's never really, okay, let me listen to the sound clip. No, it's like, let me see a screenshot of what it looks like. I mean, we're both older, right? You remember going to Best Buy and like taking a look at a game and the box art, and it looks cool, but then you immediately flip it over and take a look at the screenshots.
That's also an era where like the box art was like, had nothing to do at all with with the game. Like these days, even if it's like an illustration, there's a lot more attention paid to make sure it at least like, connects to the game. Whereas like back then, like it's like, who the hell illustrated this? It's like, this has nothing to do with what they. I guess you can kind of see that these days though with the, when you have mobile ads for games, like, some of these ads for games, like on mobile, it's like what they're advertising. It's like, is that actually what the game is like?
Well, we have a question from our audience, right? So the reason that we do this podcast live is because I want to give people a chance to chat with the guest. Sure. And ask any interesting questions that they have. He's asking if you ever worked with Unity ECS.
It's funny. It's he's referring, by the way, for I guess those of you who don't use Unity, he's referring to the entity component system. That's ECS. But the short answer is no. I mean, I've never worked with it myself. I have worked on projects where like somebody else, one of the other engineers on the project was dealing with that stuff. And it was interesting. I mean, on the one hand, the advantage of that approach is that you're going to get, like just some processing, speed ups, of certain kinds of things, like will just run faster. The big disadvantage though, that became really apparent once we started working that way, is you just lose a lot of the, like, Unity helping you do stuff, like there's just a lot more you have to implement yourself in order, if you're going down that route. And that starts to feel a little pointless at that point, because one of the, I alluded to one of the huge advantages of Unity is that it's ridiculously cross-platform. So like any platform you can think of. Probably the biggest, though, advantage of Unity over certain other tools is just how easy it is to use. Like it's just, everything is everything's designed in a way that makes it work pretty easy. And yeah, once you're dealing with ECS in Unity, you just kind of throw all that out the window, and then it's
Yeah, I think ECS is kind of like the most newish way to kind of structure your app, because I believe I heard something where if you do it the old way, you have a limit to how many objects you can have because of the way inheritance works. I forgot what another podcast, I had a guy on there who talked about this. He's been making games for a long time, and he was describing it that there could be a limit because objects just become very big in memory or something like that. So sorry for cutting you off.
No. I mean, yeah, it's a little, the describing it as a limit is possibly misleading, because that's going to make it sound like there's like a really hard cutoff. Like, you got X number of objects that you can have, and once you hit X, then nothing else is going to work. It's not like that. It's more, what I was saying earlier. I was talking about, like, ECS gives you a lot of performance improvements, just a lot of processing advantages, and that. So, like, yeah, absolutely. If you have a lot of objects and you're not using ECS, then your computer is just going to bog down more. Whereas, like, if you're using ECS, then, things are just going to run smoother. But like I said, the flip side of that, the downside is that, okay, but you're just going to have to do more yourself. It almost seems a little bit like, at that point, why are you using Unity even? I don't know. That's just my take on it, I suppose.
We have another question, which I think we talked about a little bit, but maybe you can give some more examples of this. Has anyone ever created a multi-platform non-game app with Unity?
Well, I mean, definitely, for sure. As far as specific examples, it does depend, because everybody's going to have a little bit of a different subjective sense of, like, what non-game means exactly, or what game means exactly. And obviously non-game is the opposite of that. Because, I mean, the thing is, when I say I've been using Unity for about 10 years, it's not like I've been developing games that entire time. I have been using Unity that entire time, but I haven't always been developing games, which would imply that a lot of my jobs have been using Unity to develop things that aren't games. But like I said, the line can get blurry, because pretty much any time you're using Unity, you're going to even if what you're developing isn't a game exactly, it's definitely going to be very game-like. It's going to have a lot of resemblance to a game. In particular, for example, like, so I'm currently, by the way, I'm currently working for Qualcomm. But Qualcomm has this gaming technologies group, relatively small for such a huge company, that just, like, focuses on developing games and how games run on Qualcomm's hardware, that kind of thing. Before I started working for Qualcomm, though, so I was working for this startup called Bundle AR, and as the name kind of implies, it was making, like, just augmented reality apps. It was making them for mobile, so, iOS and Android. It was these augmented reality apps, and they weren't games, but they were still using augmented reality. So we were using Unity to make these, like, AR training simulations, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we have another question from John, which I think is a good question to ask, right? Because this can help to determine if you can use Unity for non-games, it's a very general question, but I think I kind of understand his question. So he's asking, how is the text handling for user input?
So on the one hand, the text handling has improved in Unity. It's improved massively now over what it was like when I first started using Unity, mostly because there's this tool, and obviously the exact name is not that important. It's called TextMeshPro, but anyway, it's this tool integrated into Unity to render out glyphs with really high quality. And so the text handling in Unity these days is much better. And by these days, I mean, like, at least the last, like, 5 years or something. Like, well, since they had that tool integrated. That said, if you're looking at a project which involves a lot of text, or is heavily text based or, that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, that's where you should strongly be considering like, okay, some other sort of development platform may be more appropriate because, Unity as a game engine is definitely, it's geared more towards like graphics than text. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily geared towards, being awesome at text. So depending on what your project is.
I don't know, maybe you understand what the meaning of this one. He's asking about what about attributed text, bold, italic, etc.
On the one hand, that's, TextMeshPro, handles like a bunch of different text attributes like bold text or italicized text or whatever. But at the same time, that is an example of what I'm getting at, where like, it's not like Unity is designed to be like awesome at rendering out all kinds of neato text. It's just not designed for that.
What would be the strength of Unity in comparison to other similar tools, right? So you have the only ones that stick out to me is probably Godot and Unreal. Like what would really kind of, why would I look at Unity?
Compared to Unreal, the ease of use for sure. It's just way easier to get into Unity than it would be Unreal. I'm tempted to say the other big, advantage is also an advantage for Unity, but I guess I'm less certain of that one. It's just like I feel like Unity is probably just more cross-platform, if you will, than Unreal. Like as for Godot's a really interesting option. It's just plain newer, so there's just not as much stuff. You know what I mean? So it's not as mature a tool. Is this, how it is when there's a certain, like, if a tool is not mature, then there's not so much like a specific, this is the problem, as just generally like everything's a little, dicey. But, on top of that, there's the fact that, and Unity, by the way, also went through, growing pains along the same lines. It's very up in the air, or more up in the air in terms of its programming language, in terms of the programming backbone. Because, so in Unity, all the programming is done in C#, in the language C#. This was not true when Unity, like when it first came out. When it first came out, it used a language which, quote unquote, was JavaScript. I use quotes though because it was like Unity's version of JavaScript. It definitely wasn't normal JavaScript. And then they introduced C#, and so now you could either use what people refer to as Unity script, or you could use C#. And then eventually it just kind of dropped the Unity script because using the C# was so much better. I feel like Godot is in the midst of a similar kind of growing pains where it's just, there's like, I forget what their language that they started with is called. I think is GDScript or something, and then now it's also supporting the C# now. And then, so, who knows? As far as Unreal, to be fair, I should also, one of its upsides I should point out, like, so first off, Unreal is just straight up, it's the main engine used by, big time game developers. Even though Unity has a rightful claim to being the most used game engine, it's used more than Unreal is. Unreal's used more in all the big studios. Like Unity has very little penetration in like the really big game studios. Where it gets used a ton is for all these like smaller studios or mobile games or independent games, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's speaking to the Unreal being way harder to get into. For example, like it's programmed in C++, which is just a more complicated language for people to start working with. You can do a lot with a feature called blueprints in Unreal, but again, that's like a whole other ecosystem that, it sort of starts to, like, I mean, actually, getting back to what we were saying earlier about the whole Flutter and Unity having some sort of integration, that's the thing, is you can do that with Unity, can't do that kind of thing with Unreal, so.
I want to kind of go back to the languages, right? I was around when you had 3 languages you could use within Unity. It was like Bool, which I think was a Python-like language. And then there was, like you said, the JavaScript one. And then they also had C#.
Bool, I have to assume, was like somebody's pet project there. Cause like, I'm just like, did any users of Unity use Bool really? Like, I'm like, that was confusing. As far as the whole Unity script thing, though, it's so when I first encountered Unity, and technically this was actually even before I worked at Synapse Games. Like the first time I ever wrote anything in Unity was even before I started working for Synapse Games, actually. But at the time, I used their Unity script to write something. So then later, though, when I started using it for real at Synapse Games, I just went, we just went with C#. And one of the first things I did then is take my this demo I wrote years ago in Unity script and just like port it over, rewrite it with C#, and the syntax was so much nicer. And even though I didn't know it at the time, it turns out that was future-proofing things, because now I can still run that demo, even though like Unity for quite some time now has completely dropped all support for Unity script. Like it just plain won't run that code anymore.
Yeah, on another podcast I'm on, I interviewed this guest who's making like an easier wrapper game engine around an existing game engine. I guess you just call it a wrapper, whatever. He was talking about when he was trying to learn Unity, and he was like, first, he's like, because he's a Python developer, right? And so he picked Bool, which I think was the name of, I forgot which one's which, right? He picked the Python-like syntax one. And then he's like, crap, they dropped that one. All right, I'm gonna use the JavaScript one because I'm a full stack guy. I know JavaScript. Crap, they dropped that one too because it was around similar time, not too far after. And he was like, geez, forget about this. I'm not going to get into Unity now.
Well, it is funny. I mean, so first of all, like I said, the fact that they ever referred to it as JavaScript was such a lie, because, like I said, it really, the resemblance to JavaScript in other places. I mean, JavaScript in the browser, which is the only place that really defines, like, this is what JavaScript is. This is how JavaScript runs in the browser. The JavaScript in Unity did not run like JavaScript in a browser, which meant, like I said, a lot of people quite rightly were like, okay, well then this isn't JavaScript. We're going to call it Unity script because it's a totally separate language. It just happens to share some of its syntax with JavaScript. But as far as C# goes, though, at a basic level, it's quite easy to pick up, actually. So, obviously your friend there, I mean, now it's too little too late, doesn't really matter. But, if for encountering him, right now, if I were encountering him right now, I would just say, like, even though you've never programmed in C# before, I would say just, I mean, it's not going to take you, like, it's not going to be hard to pick up, honestly. Like, in my case, for example, I'd been programming in ActionScript 3, which was, in Flash. But the thing is, so ActionScript 3 was basically, Adobe's ripoff of Java is what it was. Like, and considering that C# is in some ways like basically Microsoft's ripoff of Java, then it actually felt very familiar to me. It's like, wow, I already know exactly how, all of this works. Coming from Python, yeah, I mean, it's going to look more different than in that case. But, I mean, it would still, at least the logic of it, like how it operates, is still going to feel very familiar because it's an object-oriented language. Once you know how, like, sort of classes operates, how inheritance works, then, like, no matter which language you're dealing with, like, those sort of abstract concepts are going to be, like, they operate the same way.
I'm kind of curious about how close it is to C#, right? Because I'm sure it cannot be one-to-one, like when a new version of C# comes out, you get a new version of Unity, and it's going to be exactly the same.
Actually, so the C# in Unity is just straight up, like, it's not like Unity's version of C#. It's just straight up C#, which already was a huge advantage. Like whereas like JavaScript in Unity was sort of like, yeah, JavaScript. C Sharp's not like that. It's just straight up, it is C Sharp. That said, it does, as you know, like, or as you intuit there, it does tend to lag a bit behind sort of like the latest .NET version or whatever. But that's not a case of like they've made a separate language. They're just like a version behind what is the latest version that's been released. It's like if C Sharp, I don't know, version 7 has just been released and Unity's still using C Sharp version 6. It'll be that kind of situation. So, but yeah, it's very much like working in Unity. You're using C Sharp, you're programming C Sharp. Actually, the biggest difference, the biggest confusion there for people who are really experienced with C Sharp coming into Unity is just like the whole ecosystem around the language is going to be changed for them. The language itself is going to operate exactly the same, but they no longer have access to stuff like NuGet, for example, which is like in C Sharp, it's the package manager. Like, Unity doesn't work the same way as far as its package.
And I think it's using Mono underneath too. So Mono's like
it was. The situation there is a lot more complicated these days. In fact, with my book.
Before we talk too much about this, I just want to do you mind to give a quick background of like what is Mono and more about this stuff? Because
sure,
this is a Flutter podcast, yeah.
Back when C Sharp and .NET were first released, were first developed by Microsoft. They only worked on Windows. .NET was like this, tool for programming like on Windows-based servers, that kind of thing. Mono then was this open source project. I think it was open source. I don't know, whatever. It was a project to develop sort of a cross-platform, sort of like layer for C Sharp. So like, in other words, you can have your C Sharp programs running on Linux now using Mono, that kind of thing. It's largely, at this point, Mono's become redundant. And then meanwhile, within Unity itself, even though you're still programming in C Sharp all the time, now there's more of a, instead of like running on a virtual machine being provided by Mono or something like that, it's actually like getting compiled down into native code and then like transpiled over to work natively. I don't know the details of that entire process. But like, I don't know if you've ever heard of like, for example, nscriptm, like that, for example, that's just a tool which for Unity's web deployments, like it just takes your code and then turns it into like web assembly using like these like transpiling tools and stuff like that. So that's why these things exist. Or similarly for iOS, it's sort of like because, Apple doesn't like you, isn't going to let you run your code on top of some sort of virtual machine, then like all of their code has to actually be like sort of compiled down into, the native code for Apple, that kind of thing.
Well, that's quite interesting because I remember like whenever you want to run something in .NET, you always had to install this .NET runtime similar to the JRE.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm talking about is how Unity gets around to requiring that is by essentially having like this tool chain, which now compiles it down into native code instead of requiring you to run on top of like the .NET runtime or the Mono runtime. Yeah.
That's super interesting. So that's a really great comparison with the way Flutter works too, right? Because Flutter's kind of got two different runtime modes. I don't think Unity does the same thing, but like the runtime mode is like you have this hot reload thing where it's like it ships a VM to your device, even for iOS, Android. And every time you save a file, it could actually just compile the code and send that change up to the VM and hot reload your app so that you can see the changes as you're developing. Actually, like you said, you can't ship a VM to the app store, so you have to compile it to native. So Dart also has that native compilation, which will give you exactly what you're talking about. But I'm guessing that probably has the same thing where it also has to ship some small components such as a garbage collector. Because obviously, I mean, C#, you're not explicitly releasing data like you would in C++ for Unreal. So you have something I guess must be very similar.
No, and then it's funny, but incidentally, you mentioned garbage collection, just because like I just have like a side note in my book at one point for people just talking about garbage collection and just one oddity about it in Unity, which I mean, in retrospect, makes perfect sense, but it's sort of like it could catch you off guard initially. It's sort of like in Unity, even if you release all references to an object in your code, there could still be a reference to that object in Unity itself. And so that's why Unity's API includes this command to destroy objects. So like basically destroy what it's literally doing is it's telling the engine like, okay, you don't care about this object anymore. At that point, so what can happen is like even if you clear out all references to an object in your code, if you haven't destroyed the object, Unity would still be hanging on to a reference to that object. Meanwhile, the reverse can also happen where like you destroy an object, but you haven't released your references to the object. So in either case, you get this situation where like it can't be swept up by garbage collection because there's still a reference to the object. But you know what I mean? So like I said, it's in retrospect, that makes perfect sense. But until I point this out, it's sort of like, oh yeah, that could trip you up a little.
Well, that's a little bit worrisome. That I mean, actually, so that's actually something I wanted to bring up about. Sorry, is like it is a garbage collected language, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and for me, like garbage collection always has this stigma, like, you know, stop the world, and I need to search the memory, and like, how can, like, I'm always thinking in my mind, how can Unity be a good choice for a game engine when it's garbage collected, right? So, like out here, we have people who are writing low latency Java, which to me doesn't really make sense because of the garbage collection, where somehow they can use this to write very, very high, very fast working code in Java with very little bit of allocations, which helps to kind of keep it going. Like, how can I be, you know, how can I run an engine where things are always changing and feel comfortable that a user's not going to have a bad experience at some point?
As you mentioned, like there are ways of writing the code to minimize the number of allocations. And the other thing that ends up happening with games, which is interesting, is like you make sure not to release objects until you're comfortable with them being garbage collected. So in other words, like, okay, so there's this technique called object pooling in game development, where basically if you are going to need enemies, you know, spawning in, and then the player kills them and the enemy's gone, and then more enemies spawn in. Well, then instead of like constantly creating and destroying these enemy objects, what you can do is actually just sort of like when an enemy is killed, just move it off screen or hide it or whatever. And then next time you need an enemy to spawn, just grab this one and put it back in. And so in other words, like the actual like memory has never been created or destroyed. It's just kind of moved, you know? And yeah, you do stuff like that. That's one part of my response. The other part though, circling way back to, you know, the ECS thing from earlier. This is among the things that ECS is, you know, can help streamline is, just again, like just streamlining the flow of the data. But as I was saying, like at that point, it's sort of like, you know, yeah, you got to manage more of it yourself. So it's just like, it just becomes more complicated.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, so actually the other thing I would point out though, for your listeners, the other thing I'd point out though is like these kind of concerns also to a certain extent, I mean, they become like, I'm sure you've heard that programming maxim about like, you know, premature optimization being the root of all evil. Yeah, that's the thing is like worrying about this stuff sometimes, depending on what you're creating, can be a bit of a premature optimization kind of trap, where it's sort of like if you're making Grand Theft Auto 5 and you were trying to do in Unity, yeah, it probably wouldn't work. The Unity is not really designed for that kind of open world huge game. But more to the point, unless you're making like some really, really huge detailed game like that, a lot of this stuff, you're just not going to hit some of these limitations anyway, you know? And so just spending lots of time worrying about it it's just kind of like you're worrying about the wrong thing, you know?
So there must be ways that we can actually measure, how our code's doing, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly different profiling tools and whatnot. I mean, obviously, when you're working with games, the way like what is being profiled can change from what you may be used to in other kinds of apps. I mean, among other things, like you start needing to profile the graphics. Like what is the graphics card? What is the GPU spending its time doing? Like what is it spending its time rendering onto the screen? That kind of thing. More of your profiling effort is going to start going into that kind of stuff. But profiling the CPU still matters for sure. I mean, just where are the I don't know, expensive loops happening in my code, that kind of thing, and then can I break them out? Or another thing that I personally have ended up doing a lot of is as I'm profiling, I also start to see like, okay, but what are things, like what are tasks that I can break out over, over some like multiple frames or something? Because, with a game, naturally you're going to have like, okay, here's one frame of the graphics being displayed and then a bunch of stuff's happening. Another frame's going to be displayed, yada, yada. But like sometimes the calculations happening between the frames, like they don't always need to be happening. Like, a great example there would be like, there are certain AI calculations, which, maybe my first naive approach would be to have that calculation happen in every frame for every single enemy in the game. But then if I realize through profiling that that's too expensive, I might start like staggering, which AI actually makes that particular update every frame. And the reason being that, I mean, realistically, how long does it take you to react to like something happening? You know what I mean? Like, you don't need the AI to be like constantly monitoring the environment around it, like every single frame.
Yeah, our friend of the show, John Cumming, who's been asking the questions about text, just stated that, root of all evil, premature optimization. Definitely true.
Yeah. And like I said, with games, I mean, games have their own sort of version of that. Because like every kind of development, it always seems like there's this thing people worry about that like, maybe they shouldn't be spending all their time worrying about. And with games, worrying so much about, what are the like how much of a performance hog, like this or that thing is, it can be a premature optimization kind of problem because it's sort of like, well, until your game actually starts running slow though, maybe it just doesn't matter.
Actually, there's one thing I did want to ask about. So one of the praises about Flutter is the excellent tooling, right? So we have this, because it's running a VM during debug, we can hook into the VM and we can get a lot of stats like, actually even about frame rates, right? Because they always boast we got 60 frames per second. So you can see dips in frames and you can see, you got debugger, things like that. So the tooling specifically for your app development is rather good in comparison to some others out there. What about the tooling within Unity, right? That's kind of built into if I just install Unity or is there something I have to reach out to other places to get? Like, how can I, get the most out of my Unity and make sure it's running as well as it can be?
On the one hand, there's the tooling built into Unity itself. And then there's the tooling that's actually provided by platforms you'd be running. And that tooling tends to be more about the graphics themselves. Like, so information about how the graphics are performing is often going to be reported to you by the platform itself. A great example of that being like, for example, if you have an iOS app, let's say you're making a mobile game and you have an iOS app, then Apple provides a lot of tools for reporting about how your rendering performance is going, that kind of thing. As far as the CPU performance, what's happening on the compute side, though, that tends to be more in Unity. It's Unity is providing that. You tend to be more relying on Unity. Now, one thing Unity does, which is super useful. This is somewhat of a tangent because this isn't talking about the tooling necessarily, but it just in that same sort of vein, like just talking about like debugging or how you can, fix problems in your app. One thing that Unity does that's super useful, and I don't know that this is unique per se, but I've never worked with, I hadn't worked with any other tools that do this, so that it's pretty cool. While the game is running, you can so basically Unity does this thing where while you're working on the game, to save you time, you don't constantly have to be deploying to the target device. You can just be running it in the editor. That in and of itself isn't the unique part, but so Unity works that way. But what that also means though is then while you're running in the editor, it has the capability for you to keep editing the game while it's running. And among other things, that lets you just sort of like navigate around the scene and just look at things. And I don't know, it is pretty handy to be able to, even while the game is running, continue to like treat it like you're still just sort of like editing. You still have all the tools to be able to, edit the scene while the game is running. It's the way it's designed. It's like any change you make while the game is running isn't saved into the scene. It's sort of like all those changes are going to be reverted. But the point is you get to inspect stuff, while it's running, and that's really helpful.
Yeah, that sounds like the hot code reload from Flutter, where you can kind of tweak things as you're going along, but it's maybe a little bit more permanent because you're literally saving to the file and it's kind of coming up. But you're saying that for this part, you can only tweak it, and then like you have to kind of go back and add your changes back to the file again after you tweak things?
Yeah, well, and I mean, it's funny. It's sort of like if you make changes because those changes aren't going to be saved permanently, it can actually be a bit of a gotcha in that sense where like I make a change and then I'm like, why didn't my change save? And it's like, oh, right, I made it while the game was running. But the thing is, this isn't intended for you to be making changes anyway. It's really intended more so that you can inspect things while it's running, Like while the game is running, you can be like, why is, I don't know, why is that enemy over there doing that thing? And then you can actually like, go over and click on that enemy and inspect, like the stats for that enemy and be like, oh.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty nice. I think anything visual, you really need that kind of thing where you can play with it while it's running, because it's always like the thing. It's always like you're compiling and you're like, damn, I forgot to, change the color or something like that. And you're like, crap, I got to stop it from compiling, change it, recompile it again. And then it's always like, after it's running, oh yeah, this one too. Why didn't I do that? And then you have to stop it again. The cycle is crazy.
There's definitely that, but there's also the fact that, and while this is going to be true to a certain extent with any kind of app, this is especially true with like games or simulation kind of apps. It's you just have a lot of things, more things that you need to see running live, whereas versus like with other kinds of development, I feel like just dropping in a breakpoint, while you're still going to do that in Unity, it's just less useful because as soon as you hit the breakpoint, the game stops. You know what I mean? Whereas like there's just generally going to be more problems where like you need to actually inspect it while the game is going. Like you need to be seeing things live happening.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely. I was thinking like if you try to like wrap like a, what do they call that? Is it a mesh or a pattern like around like a shape, right? I'm just thinking like GoldenEye when they had like the faces and wrap it around the shape, the polygons and stuff, things like that. That would be interesting. Okay, I think I got a pretty good round of information about this. I think it's a pretty good kind of introduction to using Unity and why you'd want to take a look at it. And we actually, a friend of the show again just mentioned in the chat that he's downloading Unity Personal for his Mac OS right now. So maybe you inspired him to kind of take another look at it or something. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you wanted to say? I also have a couple of wrap-up questions.
I guess I would just, sort of reiterate that my book is, is great for somebody who's already a seasoned developer wanting to learn Unity. Because so one thing that I find happens a lot with seasoned developers is it happens a lot less these days, I have to admit, because over time, like, where people like get it, the truth is out there, if you will. But definitely when I first started using Unity, this was a huge problem, is for various reasons, and Unity itself was part of the problem. Is like their marketing did this, but people just didn't think it was a tool that you could do programming in. Like they seem to think it was a tool that you just kind of like click together and you're not programming and then stuff happens. And it's like, it's not like that at all. It is definitely a tool you're doing real programming in to get stuff to happen. So I would, yeah, that's what I would point out is, if anything, these days between, Unity and Unreal, for example, Unity has the reputation of being the more programmer friendly tool, than Unreal, in large part because, it cares a lot more about, it seems like, a lot more attention is paid to, sort of like not just games, with the result that, for example, Unity has like integrations with Flutter and stuff like that.
Yeah, your comment about the for developer thing. Again, the same guy who wrote the wrapper, he was talking about like he ran into some bugs within the game engine, and he kind of reached out to the team, and they kind of came back to him, and they were like, "Listen, yeah, there's a bug there. We'll fix it eventually, but for the time being, why don't you just ask your support guy who helps to support the engine on your side to make a workaround for this?" And he's just like, "I'm one guy by myself. I don't have a whole team over here to help support the Unreal Engine. Like, I just want to make my game." That was kind of why he didn't go the Unreal route. So that's another thing too. Like, and I'm guessing that, how does Unity handle this kind of thing if you find a bug in the engine itself?
If somebody finds like, an engine level bug or whatever, like, it'll probably take them a little bit of time to, like fix that or whatever. But I mean, okay, so, Unity, in terms of versions, actually, another interesting thing I should point out, they have sort of like their latest version of Unity, but then they have this, what they refer to as LTS releases. LTS stands for long-term support. So the idea with the LTS versions is your feature set is going to be frozen in time now. However, it's going to keep integrating bug fixes. So the idea with an LTS version is, for example, like, let's say for, because of the plugins you're using, they're locked into like the previous version of Unity or something like that. Well, then, so you can still be using that version of Unity, but let's say, just as, this is a totally random example. This never happens ever in real life. God damn it. Anyway, let's say Apple changes their requirements, so now iOS apps need to have this or that, feature enabled in order to be submitted. Like now they all have to have 64-bit support. It was obviously a thing that happened at one point. That kind of thing. And that change would have to be made at the engine level in Unity. Well, now that change can be integrated into the long-term support version, but nothing else changes. So, you know what I'm saying? That way you're getting bug fixes. You're benefiting from the bug fixes while still being frozen in time feature-wise, because for, various reasons you might have to do that. That's, as you can imagine, that kind of duality in terms of the support can be very helpful then, because now you're able to get your bugs fixed without having this sort of like, well, you're just kind of stuck on an old version. Sorry. It's because, that would really suck.
Yeah. Okay. It kind of reminds me of like Ubuntu. They have always this LTS that they run for a couple of years and just bug fixes.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that they had this system. Is this something that came out a couple of years ago with this LTS version?
I don't know when they started doing it. It's definitely relatively new. I want to say like maybe 3 years they've been doing this. Because like before that, things would get a little comparatively hairy in terms of like, if there were bug fixes, but you were stuck on an older version of Unity, then how do you benefit from this bug fix? Then, that was becoming, enough of a hairy situation often enough that Unity just decided like, okay, you know what? We're going to do this sort of like 2-tiered release kind of thing. So,
okay. Yeah, if there's nothing else, then I can give my last couple of questions. Basically, do you have any tips or tricks for beginners or any kind of warnings you want to give to them when they're starting off on their Unity journey?
Specific tips and tricks? I mean, as you can imagine, having written an entire book about Unity, it's sort of like, well, my book is peppered with, tips. So it's hard for me to say like, oh yeah, this is the most important ones. So I mentioned before, by the way, TextMeshPro, for text handling in Unity. How is this for a tip? Make sure if your game involves any text in it, which almost all games are going to involve some amount of text in them, you're using TextMeshPro, and you're not just using like sort of the vanilla text objects Unity provides. Because at this point, honestly, I'm actually a little annoyed that Unity still even supports their vanilla text objects. I have to assume the fact that it's even still in there is just legacy reasons. Like, so that old projects won't like just sort of break. Because if you were coming to Unity, developing a new project from scratch in Unity, you should not be using the vanilla text objects. You should be using TextMeshPro because it is so much better. And like I said, the fact that there even still are the vanilla text objects is a little bit annoying to me, because that's going to make, newcomers confused, like, oh, well, shouldn't I be using that? And it's like, no.
Okay. It's pretty good. Our buddy John Cumming just said there's no M1 version of Unity yet.
M1?
I guess it'll take some time. Yeah, for Apple M1 chips,
gotcha. For Apple, yes. I would not be surprised though if Unity they just sort of like recompile their engine for that very, very soon. I mean, because that like basically it's one of those things where it's sort of like support for platform level changes like that. The support, like how quickly Unity responds to those changes. It can depend on the change. It can depend on the severity, but let's face it, it can depend a lot on the platform. And, like just something like, let's get our engine running on Apple computers. Like, they're going to get on that ball pretty quickly. I mean, so it's funny, a little quirk of history with Unity, which most people like forget because it doesn't really matter that much these days, but it is interesting. Unity, back when it first was created, it was actually Mac only. I was talking about how, sort of like ridiculously cross-platform it is. As you can imagine, though, that happened over time. And its first release was Mac only. And now, admittedly, it didn't even take it I think it was like a matter of like months. Like we're talking like 4 months before I had a Windows build. But still, it did not have a Windows build when it was first released.
That's odd considering like C# and they're using Mono, but
again, remember what I said. It didn't start supporting C# until sometime later. And then once it did, they were like, wow, this is so much better than our built-in, made up JavaScript. Yeah, never mind. Use this. So, yeah.
Oh, I thought the C# support was there from the beginning.
No, it's not.
Okay, that's interesting. I wonder why they decided to add C# out of all the other languages, though.
I couldn't tell you the exact answer. I will say, though, as my personal suspicion would be that there's just, even though C# isn't a language that's used a lot within the game itself, other than Unity, of course, like, when you're looking at a game engine like Unreal, or you're looking at these different big game companies, if their internal tools, they're going to be like these C++ engines. However, C# does get used a lot in game studios, mostly for writing tools, actually. And because C# was a language getting used so much in game studios, that I suspect is the reason that they wanted to have C#. Unity wanted to have C# support, is just because there were so many people in game studios who knew C#. They're like, oh yeah, let's get all these people. And then once the language was actually integrated, they just realized, like, for other reasons, wow, this is actually a really great choice. So
I'm wondering if it's because, like, a lot of games are kind of written for PC rather than Mac and Linux, and C# is kind of the language for Windows apps, so maybe that's got some relation to that. Plus, you have the large corporations that usually have Windows, and they're managed, and they're locked down, and you have to use Outlook and all these kind of things that you're kind of stuck in that ecosystem. I don't know. It's a good question. I'm just trying to think about why that would be. That kind of comes to my mind, why maybe C# would be there. But yeah, I mean, it would be good to actually hear somebody from Unity to see what was the kind of evolution, what was the roadmap, and what happened. So I don't think they'd be saying, "Oh yeah, that was a mistake to make Bool." And they say, "It's part of the evolution, you gotta crawl first."
When I refer to the sort of like this ancient history of Unity, I mean, back then, Unity isn't a thing anyone heard about. Unity didn't start being an engine that anyone really cared about until like iOS was invented. Like, because obviously, when did iOS first come out? Like 2008, and then very quickly after that, I don't remember now exactly how long, but quickly. Very quickly after that, Unity started supporting it. And I'm pretty sure Unity was like the first 3D engine, which actually could deploy games onto iOS, that was a major feather in their cap, at the time. And so, they got a lot of traction really fast because of that.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Okay. I think we need to wrap over here way over time. And I do appreciate, your time and all the background you can give. So I think I'll have to plan on looking at Unity whenever I have a chance. And definitely check out his book. Seems like it should be a good, just from chatting with you and just kind of glancing at the book a little bit, that it seems like, it should be a pretty good resource for people who are interested in checking out Unity.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your time. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for inviting me on. It's like when we were chatting before, is one of the things I was pointing out is definitely, if anyone's curious about Unity and wants to chat with me about Unity, I'm like, I'm there, dude.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's funny. It's because I've written a book about Unity. There are some people who seem to think I don't know, I have some sort of like personal stake in this tool. And it's like, well, no. On the one hand, no. I mean, like, I used to, before I started using Unity, I used to use other tools, and I just switched because it was the best choice at the time. It's not like I work for Unity. So no, I don't have any personal stake in Unity. So I guess what I mean is, like, if somebody points out downsides in Unity, I'm not going to be like personally offended or something. But the flip side of it is like, yeah, but I mean, after all these years, almost around a decade, I've been using it. I mentioned, I mean, I'm still using it by choice because I think it's a really great tool.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I think I think everybody should just check it out and see for themselves, right? It may or may not be the right fit for you. So you'll find out once you start playing with it. The C# thing, I want to talk a little bit about C# for just a second. Like C# was kind of like a copy, so forth, of Java, but now it's actually become something on its own, I would say.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's changed quite a bit. And so, yeah, I think, C# is also another interesting language to take a look at.
Sure. No, it's definitely, it's when I described it as you point out, like at least, when it was first created, and not so much it's evolved, definitely. But like when it was first created, I mean, when I described it as like pretty much, it was, and it started out as like Microsoft's ripoff of Java. I didn't say that as like some sort of dig on C#. I really like C# actually. I think it's a great language. I like programming in it. I'm just, just objectively, I mean, that's pretty much how it started, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Again, thank you for coming on, and check out his book. And I just wanted to also let you guys know, if you're interested to purchase his book, please buy it directly from Manning.com. Do not buy it from Amazon or other places. And that's because if you buy it from Manning.com directly, he will get a bigger cut, because obviously, Amazon has to take their cut. And then, of course, they give whatever left to Manning, and Manning takes their cut. And then you get kind of the cents on the dollar, right? from the book. So if you are interested in Unity and you want to really help him out, he's not going to get rich from his royalties from the book. But I think the point is, try to give him as much as you can, because, every developer needs coffee. So it's coffee and money at this point, I think, for every book he sells. But yeah, so I just want to make that very clear. Buy the book from Manning.com. Do not buy it from Amazon and others, because it definitely more support goes to him. Thank you for your time. And maybe we'll have you back on again in the future if something kind of substantial changes. Otherwise, I think it's a great entry to talk about Unity.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much.